All right, so thank you everyone for joining us this morning. This is the Coach Socialization series brought to you by Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic. We've been running these sessions since the beginning of the isolation period in Nova Scotia, and we're really excited for the presentation today. This has been a topic that has been requested for coaches for a long time, and we were planning to have this presentation at the Atlantic Coaches Conference in April that had to be canceled due to the current situation across the globe. So we're really excited to have Dr. Adriana Wilson here with us this morning. She's an international speaker, is the founder of Inspired Living Medical and the co-founder of Dynamic Wellness Halifax. She's been providing some resources for our coaches in Nova Scotia that we're really grateful for. Dr. Wilson completed her medical degree at the University of Manitoba and her specialty training as a psychiatrist at Dalhousie University here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She holds a master's in education and her professional designation is in conflict resolution. So we're really excited to have her here this morning to answer some questions that we have about mental health and coaching. So we have 4 questions that coaches have asked prior to this presentation. So we will be asking those 4. And then if anyone has any follow-up questions or other questions, please either use the chat box to write those out or open up your mic when we say so and you can ask questions to Dr. Wilson. So our first question. Actually, before we get into questions, Dr. Wilson, did you want to add any more to that bio or say anything? Feel free to.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
If anyone has any specific questions, I'm happy to answer them about my past, but okay, it's good.
Okay, thanks. So the first one is, what are some strategies on supporting athletes who are planning on retiring from their competitive sport and due to COVID-19, their season was cut short?
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting question. So it really ends up being 2 questions because one of them pertains to how do we support retiring athletes, because that's a thing in and of itself. And then the other part is how do you support retiring athletes whose season was cut short by something that has been, globally unprecedented. So I'll answer the cut short part first, and then I'll talk more generally about how to support the retiring athletes. So when it comes to anything where we have been heavily invested and there's been a lot of ideas or expectations that have gone into how something will go. So some of the classic examples would be, having a baby or getting married or, graduating from something. So where there's this kind of idea of how it would go, then when that gets cut short, then that means that we're going to need to then focus on clarifying what our expectations were so that we can then grieve what it is that we no longer are going to get. That it's, we thought that our life was going to go in this direction and then something happened and kind of tilted us off course, and that's made us have to rethink how we're going to continue to get our needs met, our role or our identity. And so the first thing I would say is anything where you're heavily invested and you have strong ideas about how it's supposed to go in your mind, then being able to take a moment to reflect on what were my expectations about how this was going to go, what was supposed to happen in my mind, realistic or not, it doesn't matter, and then making room to actually grieve that loss. And when I talk about grieving, then there's been a lot of talk in the media about grieving lately, because in the context of COVID, for many, many reasons, then we're needing to mourn the loss of our former normal, right? How we interacted with people, how we got our needs met, how we engaged recreationally. So you may have heard some of this in recent times anyway, but it's the same principles of grieving. So there tend to be a few specific stages that we go through, and it's not linear. So the stages that I'm about to talk about, it's not everybody starts at denial or everybody starts at anger. The stages are fluid and people can move in and out of the different stages and then progress through to another one and then come back. But typically the stages of grieving, a helpful framework for that would be that people often go through at different points a stage of denial, anger, negotiating or bargaining, sadness, and then eventually acceptance and the ability to create meaning out of whatever the situation has been. So it's important to understand that, you know, I might initially be very angry that COVID has changed my ability to, you know, retire in the way that I had wanted. And often people we have this tendency to zoom in as soon as pain or suffering kind of comes onto the stage. If you think of life as a stage, then as soon as pain or suffering comes on stage, we have this tendency to zoom in on just that pain and suffering, and we lose sight of the bigger picture. So then for people who are retiring, and this is how their retirement kind of happens, then it would be very tempting to get sucked into focusing on, this is the representation of my career, as opposed to being able to zoom out and see everything that's been on stage, and that this is just the ending of it, but that doesn't actually change the value and the lessons learned and how their identity was formed around all of the things that came before that. So just to recap what we've talked about so far, then it's about helping athletes get closure who are being forced to retire in a way that they didn't expect. And in order to do that, then it's encouraging them to take time to reflect on what their expectations had been, and then informing them about the need to make time and space to grieve the loss of those things. Does that make sense to people so far? Yeah, there's some nods. Awesome. So just to add to that a little bit is that I talked about making meaning. So one of the ways that we can help athletes or help each other make meaning out of difficult situations, and it's really important that we learn how to make meaning. Actually, I'll backtrack just a second, because meaning is one of the ways that provides us a huge source of motivation and perseverance. So for instance, if I asked you to walk across a bed of hot coals for no reason in your bare feet, then you would feel every burn as you walked across that bed, because you'd be like, this is nonsensical. This doesn't make sense. Why am I even doing this? But if I asked you to walk across a bed of hot coals in your bare feet, so the exact same scenario, only this time it's to save the life of the person who means the most to you, then we wouldn't even notice the burning until after. Because being able to connect to meaning not only helps us gather and muster up perseverance and motivation, but it also helps us integrate information into the narrative of our life. So when things happen that are difficult in particular, that we don't end up making meaning from, then they end up kind of being a little bit like a hernia. If anybody knows what a hernia is, it can be like, it's a piece of your inner body that pops out that's not supposed to pop out. And some people know, they're smiling. I can see you going, yeah, I know what hernia is. So it's when it pops out. And so it's a part of you the whole time. It's been a part of you, but then it's like outside of you, and then anything can make it hurt. So like wearing a shirt, rubbing it, the wrong way, it all hurts. And so it becomes raw and inflamed and sensitive. And so when we have difficult things that have happened in our lives that we haven't dealt with, then they can become like a hernia. They're a part of us, but they're kind of like right there on the surface. They're sticking out and they're causing pain and suffering. And our task is to find, how does this fit in me, in my narrative, in my story, in my life? And so our task then emotionally is to process it enough to be able to kind of tuck it back in and help it find where it needs to be. And so one of the ways we can do that is by facilitating making meaning, which is a very simple process, but simple isn't always easy. So typically it would be asking 3 questions. And this is worth writing down if people are interested in this topic. So to make meaning, you ask, what did I lose from this experience? And then you have an honest conversation with yourself about what did you lose? Emotionally, physically, professionally, in terms of your identity. The next question is, what did I gain? And so it could be that you gained clarity about the importance of, structure or socializing or, competition. And then the last question is, what did I learn? And so sometimes people get confused between what did I gain and what did I learn, because they both kind of seem to be focusing more on the moving forward piece. But what did I learn is specifically, what am I going to take from this experience and use in my life moving forward? So how am I going to take what I gained and turn that into tangible behavioral changes or actions moving forward in my life? So to give an example that may be, related to COVID, for instance, then it may be that what they lost for a lot of people, then they've lost a sense of safety and stability. They've lost connection. Many people have lost financial security and financial stability as well. Part of what they may have gained is an appreciation for how adaptable and resilient they are, because as a community, we have all transitioned very, very quickly, not always gracefully, but very quickly. And so gaining an understanding of some of how much grit a person has might be one of the things that they've gained, and also how much they actually do enjoy going out and physically connecting with other people face to face, that maybe they didn't appreciate in the same way before. I personally had not appreciated how much of a hugger I am until I couldn't hug everybody anymore. And so there might be things along those lines. And then lastly, the what did I learn might be moving forward. Once everything opens up again, maybe I'm going to make a point of physically connecting with the people closest to me on a regular basis as more of a priority than I would have before if I had not gone through this experience. Does that make sense to people? Okay, so that would be my short answer to the how do we help someone whose retirement gets kind of cut short because of COVID. When we're talking about retirement in general from sports, and this is actually true from just work in general, but it applies to sports because that's another big part and investment of our identity in competitive sports. So when we're thinking about that, then I like to frame it as, I use the STAMP wellness model. So there's essentially 5 things that we need to be well. And this is true kind of across cultures, across ages. It really doesn't matter who you are as humans. We all have these same 5 fundamental needs. So the first one is the S, which is STAMP, the safety, the S of STAMP. And safety gets broken down into 3 parts. The first is financial safety, which, and these are not in any particular order. Financial safety doesn't just mean that I'm not imminently, going to not have housing or food, but it also means that the standard of living that I've become accustomed to and that my dependents have become accustomed to is not currently threatened. Because you can imagine that if, you go from being a $50,000 a year house income to being a $15,000 a year house income, you still have a roof over your head and have food on the table, but no one can tell me that they're not going to be significantly stressed by that drop, right? And so that also is connected to financial security. So there's S has financial security, and then there's physical safety. And physical safety includes having our basic needs met, being free from intimidation or violence. But then the next part is one that people often don't think about, and that's that I have enough physical health to manage the demands of my life. And that's really important because that's going to be very dependent on the person. If I'm an 80-year-old woman who is living with my adult son who helps me with my day-to-day activities, then I have very different physical safety needs than if I'm a single mom of twin 3-year-olds living on my own, right? Both of them could have something like fibromyalgia or some sort of arthritis, but it would be impacting their lives dramatically differently. So there's financial safety, physical safety, and then this is one that people often don't give enough time to reflect on, which is emotional safety. And emotional safety means that I feel like my needs are equal to your needs. I feel comfortable asking to have my needs met, and I don't feel the need to backpedal or compromise myself when someone else is upset by me asking to have my needs met. So that might look kind of concretely like that I'm able to say, yeah, I don't really feel like going for, I don't know, Taco Tuesday today. In fact, I don't even really like Mexican food. I've just been kind of going along with it because you seemed really enthusiastic about it, but I'm kind of done with Taco Tuesday. Can we please do something else? And then when the person pushes back and is like, what are you talking about? You love tacos. We've been going for tacos for like years. Then you can say, yeah, I can see how this would be coming as a shock to you, but I actually really don't like tacos. Can we please go somewhere else? Instead of someone who's not emotionally safe, first of all, would not say anything. And if they do, when there's some pushback, then they cave. So when they say, what are you talking about? They're like, you're right, it's fine. We can do tacos. It's fine. It's no big deal. We've been doing tacos forever. You're right. Let's just do tacos again. So that's the difference kind of with emotional safety. And it's the ability to set a boundary and enforce that boundary as well. So if I say, if you talk to me that way, then I'm going to have to leave. Then you actually leave the next time they talk to you that way. So the S of STAMP is safety, financial, physical, and emotional. Then the T is team or tribe, depending on the language you prefer. And we are inherently a social species. We have evolved to need each other, and we are biologically rewarded for connecting to one another, and we are compromised when we don't have that connection. So for instance, fun fact for your dinner time conversations might be that loneliness, self-reported loneliness, carries a higher overall mortality rate than alcoholism and obesity. Think about that for a minute. And also keep in mind that loneliness does not mean that I am not around people. It means that I don't feel connected to people. So people can be lonely, and I can tell you for a fact that there are tons of people who are in isolation right now with people and still feel lonely. So it's not about being around people or not, it's about how emotionally safe and connected do I feel with those people. So when we're talking about the T from STAMP, then part of that includes needing to feel emotionally safe with that person. And also it needs to be connected to us in some way that we tie into our identity. So for instance, if I strongly identify as a religious person, then I could be in a room filled with emotionally available, fabulous people, but I'm not going to feel like they get me if I identify strongly as being religious. Or similarly, I could be, if I'm a single mom, then I could be surrounded by emotionally available, fantastic two-parent families, and I'm not going to feel like they totally get what my experience is. Or if I'm heavily entrepreneurial, then I need to connect, at least for some part of my life. I need to recharge with other people who share that aspect. And you can see what's coming. If I'm an athlete, and even if I'm like a recreational athlete compared to a competitive athlete, because that's going to be different for them as well in terms of level of investment, how tied in it gets with their identity, then they're going to need to connect with other people who have that shared sense of competitiveness or striving for excellence. It doesn't mean that if I'm a competitive badminton player, I have to find other competitive badminton players, but it needs that aspect that is really important to me, that competitiveness or striving for excellence or you know, the love of the sport, whatever the parts of it that are most directly tied to their identity, they're going to need to find other people who share that, with whom they also feel emotionally safe, in order to really feel that sense of connection. So that would be the T. So safety, tribe or team, which means people with whom we feel emotionally safe and who share important aspects of our identity. Oh, and the one other kind of caveat with that is that one person will not meet all of that for us. So we can't expect our partners or our, you know, best friend to meet all of those different needs. That's kind of like having a one-legged table. And it also puts a tremendous amount of pressure on that one person to try to meet all of our emotional needs. It's telling me my internet connection is unstable. Can you still see me and hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you and see you.
Yes.
Yeah, it just, to me, it says network bandwidth is low. So I'll let you know if we can't hear you anymore.
Okay, and if it freezes and you can't tell me, then just put it in the chat.
Okay.
Because often the chat still works. Okay, awesome. Okay, so ST, okay, A is aim and ability. So as humans, then we all need a sense of purpose, like we all need a reason to get up in the morning, and we need something that we feel good at. So a sense of mastery. And those two things don't have to be the same thing. So I might get up in the morning because, you know, I'm a mom or because I have to get to my job, but my sense of mastery might actually come from my sport, or it might come from coaching, or it might come from some other recreational thing that I do. For instance, you know, I'm a physician. One of my senses of mastery definitely comes from my work, but another sense of mastery is I do blacksmithing. So I have a forge in my garage and I make stuff. So that would be one of my senses of mastery. So they don't have to be the same thing, but everybody universally, we all need a reason to get up, and we need something that we feel good at. And when we don't, and this is one of the things that has happened through the pandemic that has been tricky, is people who have lost their jobs, for instance, and when people retire, coming back to the original question, then we often lose that normal sense of purpose to get up in the morning, because it's no longer to go to work. I don't have to go to work. And, you know, puttering around and doing our groceries or learning another language or doing some gardening doesn't feel quite as pressing, because it doesn't have the same deadlines or timelines or accountability to other people sometimes. So having that sense of purpose, having that sense of mastery, and then moving on to the M. So that would be of stamp. So that would be meaning. And we've talked a little bit about the importance of meaning already. And in our lives, we universally have a need to contribute to something that is bigger than ourselves. So even when they've done anthropological studies, and they've asked children in lots of different cultures, you know, who do you want to be when you grow up, or what do you want to be when you grow up? Then they tend to report and enact and imaginative play as being figures from their community who are helping the greater community. I want to be a police officer or a doctor or a lawyer or a fireman. Nobody says, I want to be a hermit. So we tend to want to contribute in some sort of way that we see as being helpful to the community. And even in very different cultures, then they'll report wanting to be like a shaman, for instance, which has the same impact. And in imaginative play, then kids will report wanting to be superheroes, like, oh, I want to be, you know, Wolverine, or I want to be Wonder Woman. And again, it's that sense of contributing to something greater than ourselves. So there are a lot of ways that we can do that. Some people do that through having a family. Some people do that through religion or spirituality. Some people do it by being a really good friend or a caregiver or volunteering in their community. There are many different ways that we can create meaning, but it's not about how we do it. It's important that we do it. And then the last one is play. So the P is play, and play entails 3 pieces. So it requires curiosity, creativity, and challenge. And one of the things that we know from the research is that when people continue to engage in play as they age, it actually reduces their rates of cognitive decline and mild cognitive impairment. So it's not even, because in North American society, quite often people learn that play is for kids, and as adults, that's what we do when everything else is taken care of. But play actually is essential for our well-being. It helps us problem solve. It helps us think flexibly. It helps us in terms of being able to problem solve creatively and thinking outside of the box. And it also provides opportunities for social engagement, because you can play in isolation. You can do things by yourself. You can do crossword puzzles. You can learn a new language. But when we interact with other people, then all of a sudden we're also getting one of those other aspects of our STAMP model. So play is also essential for our well-being. And one of the best forms of play in terms of protective factors as we age is actually dance, because it requires full body complex movements, and it's done socially, typically. I dance in my room alone, but I also will take a partner whenever possible. So understanding that STAMP model, that there are those 5 essential things that we need to be well. The one other piece that we need to understand before we talk about specifically how that connects to retirement is that it's top heavy. So if our safety is compromised, or we don't feel like we have a team, then we're going to be quite distressed, even if we are totally rocking out on having our aim and ability, our meaning and play. So we could be doing great on those things, and if we don't have safety and team, then we're still going to be distressed, and appropriately distressed, right? We need other people in order to be well, and we need safety in order to be well. So think of it as if I took a tablespoon of salt and I put it in a glass of water and then I tried to drink it, it would be very salty and gross, right? But if I took that tablespoon of salt and I put it in a lake and I just took a sample from that lake to drink, I wouldn't even really notice it. So the more of the STAMP factors that I have, the more it's protecting me and buffering me from the natural ups and downs that happen in life. Does that resonate with people? Excellent. Okay, so now specifically how it connects to retirement is that often people have all of their STAMP wrapped into either their work or their competitive sports. So they may be getting some sort of funding or sponsorship that ties into financial safety. It's how they're staying motivated to stay physically well. It might be the place that they have the confidence to make sure that they are remaining emotionally safe and setting boundaries, because they have a reason to, right? They need to protect this state of being in a competitive sport. So it connects to safety for a lot of people. It's often, outside of work, then competitive sports can be the place where we get our social interactions. And it often is providing that sense of purpose and mastery. It can create that sense of meaning, because when we pursue excellence, that's one of the ways that people pursue a sense of meaning. And it obviously provides that sense of play, because it's offering a sense of curiosity, like, how can I do this better? How can I progress? How can I do it faster? And then we also get the creativity and challenge, like, how do I adapt so that I can be better, strive to pursue that excellence? And then finally that yields the challenge. So if your particular athlete who is getting ready for retirement does not have replacements or other things built into their lifestyle or in their world to help them start to meet those needs, you can expect that is going to be a hard adjustment. So even just having that framework in mind can be very, very helpful. It's a very long-winded way to answer the first question. Hopefully it was helpful.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. That's so great. I wasn't the coach who asked this question, but I'm definitely in the same situation where our season was suddenly cut short, and and athletes don't know what to do with their time anymore. So this is great information and a lot of applicable stuff. There's some follow-up questions in the chat box, so I'll just read them aloud. So the first one was, does the grief process apply to wins and losses during a tournament, or is that different?
Yeah, it absolutely does. That's a great question, actually. Especially if you went in expecting one thing. So the grief process really applies anytime you thought it was going to go this way and it went this way, and there's a gap between what you expected and what happened. Then that creates distress, and part of that distress is going to, it may involve anger or all of those things, but then it does end up needing to be grieved so that it can be processed and we can move on. And when I say kind of processing an emotion, a helpful way to structure that or to think of that is I like to use a process that one of my therapist friends who works with kids uses. His name is Chris Frazier. And so he uses this model where he says you name it, you soothe it, and you move it. So I'll just elaborate a touch on that. So naming it means, like, our emotions are, they're like a toddler, that if you try to ignore a toddler who's saying, look at me, over here, look, I need you to pay attention to me, come on, then the more we ignore that toddler, the louder they get. And it's like that with our emotions. If I don't know how to deal with my emotions, or I avoid dealing with my emotions, then they just kind of get louder and louder and start to interfere in more and more different aspects of our life. The other way that I talk about it is I don't love technology. Well, actually, I love technology. It does not love me. And so I periodically, when I update my computer, it like breaks essential programs for me. So I very often avoid updating my computer. And so you know how it'll come up and it's like, do you want to update now? I always say no. No, I do not want to update now. And then it'll ask again, and it'll ask again, it'll ask again. And then eventually I'm in the middle of doing something and it just says, we are updating now. And then for the next 23 minutes, I can't use my computer. So when we avoid our emotions, that happens. You know, we'll put it away, we'll push it away. And eventually it's just going to come out in a form or in a way and at a time that we don't get to choose. So it's way more helpful and constructive for us to actually make and take time to check in, and then to use this process of naming the emotion. And the naming is the acknowledging the toddler. So it's acknowledging, I'm mad, or I'm sad, or I'm disappointed. And it can be good emotions as well. It can be like, I'm happy or I'm excited, but people don't usually struggle as much to process those. So you name it, you soothe it. So it's hard for us to stay and stick with difficult emotions, just like when you're with someone who's suffering. So for instance, you know, in the context of COVID, there have been many losses. And then on top of that, quite a number of people in our community have been affected by the shootings and then the military loss that we recently had. And so, you know, if any of you have had to sit with someone who has really suffered a loss, who is hurting, who is in pain, you know that it hurts us. It's uncomfortable to do that. There has to be a willingness to be there with them. The same is true for our own emotional experiences. There has to be a willingness to be there with ourselves. And part of being able to stay with the emotions that are coming up for us comes from being able to soothe ourselves through it. So that might be, so soothing the feeling might mean journaling, or using a weighted blanket, because we know that that's like a swaddle for adults, basically. So any of you who have had children, I don't think you're supposed to swaddle anymore, but it used to be that you would swaddle the baby and they would feel contained and they would settle more quickly. So weighted blankets are one of the ways that we naturally, it's like a hug for the body, and it helps us settle. Any rhythmic, repetitive motion. So I often recommend that my patients buy an exercise ball, like a Swiss ball, because most people can't sit on an exercise ball without doing this. And that is a repetitive rhythmic motion that is actually soothing, in the same way that we naturally try to do that when we pace, when we're anxious. And even people who are profoundly mentally ill or developmentally delayed, they will rock or they will headbang rhythmically when there's a problem. And so it's being able to soothe that feeling through things like weighted blankets, using an exercise ball to soothe through the rhythmic motion. It might be doing something where you're talking to yourself or writing out to yourself, validating, soothing comments. Like, it's just a feeling, it's going to pass, I'm okay. And then moving on to the move it, then feelings are balls of energy. And we know that because if you get angry, then we all want to like do something, right? It's like this energy that wants to come up and out. And if we're sad and we have a good cry, we feel tired after because we've used up that energy. So if we block that energy, then it has to go somewhere. And we want it to go somewhere constructive. So if we provide ourselves with an outlet to move that energy, then we get through it a lot quicker. So some examples might be doing something physical, intensely physical. So doing sprints, go into your car and scream, beat the crap out of your pillow. One of the ones that I really love and do a lot is ball slams. So if you grab a ball, any ball, and it's above your head, and you slam it down and pick it up and you slam it down, because it becomes a full body movement that is allowing a discharge of any of that leftover emotional energy. Another one that's related to that is very gratifying is if you have any rotting fruits or vegetables, then throw it at a tree. Because when we're really angry or frustrated, then there's a destructive element to it. That's why like kids will like break pencils or kick their Lego. So there's something gratifying about the like splat that comes from it. And the deer will thank you because they then get to eat whatever is kind of left over. But I do not recommend that if you have very poor aim, because it just ends up being really frustrating if you're just throwing vegetables next to a tree. So I would recommend the ball slams in that case. So doing something intensely physical, doing something creative, coloring, painting, making something out of clay, even creatively organizing or doing some sort of like garden planning. Those are all creative endeavors. That creativity also can help move the energy through. So name it, soothe it, move it. So does that answer the question? I just want to make sure that.
I think so, but if not, feel free to write a follow-up in the chat box.
Okay.
For the person who asked. I think there's one more. Just going back to the loneliness comment. So even if you're with like another person, you might still feel loneliness. So I think the question was, so if you're by yourself in isolation, would you have a greater sense of loneliness?
Not necessarily, but you might. Loneliness really comes from that sense of feeling like you belong or feeling like you're emotionally connected to other people. And so there are people that I work with, because I have a clinical practice. So there are people that I work with who are in isolation with other people who they don't feel connected to, and they feel very lonely. And then I have other patients who are in isolation and don't have anyone else physically around, but they are in regular contact with people who they do feel emotionally supported by. And so they don't have the same elements of loneliness. But the thing that is unique to the people who are in isolation, not with other people, is touch. Because part of being a social species is we actually need touch. And so that can be very difficult. And we often don't appreciate how much through the day we actually do touch each other, like just, a little bit on the elbow or tap each other on the shoulder. And having no physical touch can be very difficult. And so a few things that we can do to try to help with that would be, again, the weighted blanket can be helpful, but also watching, and this sounds kind of silly, but touch is connected to the release of a neurotransmitter called oxytocin. And there's some kind of early days research that has shown that oxytocin is also released when we watch videos of babies and small animals. And so I've been recommending to a number of patients that watching videos of babies and small animals, and particularly there's some hypotheses out there that if you're watching them like hug, then that also increases that release of oxytocin. And it's not quite the same as being face-to-face, but because social, then we kind of put ourselves in that situation, and it can help us feel a little bit more connected to other things. The disclaimer with that, though, is that positive and negative emotions track together. So it can help you connect to a feeling of connection that you can expect will also intensify the feeling of loss with not having it. You'll have a bit of the buffer for having had it, but it can also make it extra sad. It's no different than some people who are in total isolation, who don't have anybody else around them. Then they really look forward to those video chats or the phone calls, but then they have an extra big sense of sadness right when they hang up, because there's that stark contrast with what they don't have. The end.
Awesome. Okay, so there was another question in the chat box, but it kind of ties into the second question. So I think we'll move on to the second question, and then if they want to follow up, they can. So the second question is, if an athlete experiences psychological trauma from a sports team, so maybe from like their coach or their teammates, etc., and no action is taken during the time of the situation, is it still possible to help them recover even years after it happened? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is yes. Yes, it's possible to recover even years later. It's helpful to understand that, again, as we're a social species, then we have this tendency to believe, especially people who are in a position of perceived power, to internalize the messages we get from them. So it's very common that if someone is an athlete and say they're mistreated, or the person who's a coach is in a position of power, has abused their power in some way, then that person is very likely to internalize that they didn't matter, like that this happened because they didn't matter, and and they internalize that. And you can imagine that that really changes the trajectory of their life, because I live my life very differently if I believe that I matter compared to if I believe that I don't matter. Or if I learned that I matter conditionally, like as long as I'm the best, as long as I'm outperforming all the other people. So it's also helpful to understand that what we believe is very heavily socially determined. So for instance, with kids, then even though it goes against everything else that they've learned, then they believe in Santa Claus because we told them so, because the people on their team who they trust said that there's a chubby man who flies around the world and gives people presents, defying all rules of gravity, physics, everything else that they know. And that is possible. And they will have fights on the playground because they are like, no, Santa is real. You are wrong. My mom and dad, my brother, my cousin, they said so, right? So it is real because of the social context that they grew up in. And then all of a sudden, when their peers start to go, no, really, it's not. And all of the adults say, actually, JK, I was kidding. There isn't a Santa. Then all of a sudden, that stops being possible, even though it was a rigidly held belief for like a decade. And so it's just a great example to illustrate how we can shift our filters, but that we sometimes do need the help of other people. And so if you're not part of a team where you are consistently getting the message that you're safe, that you're deserving, that you matter, then you may need to start seeing someone who does this professionally, like a therapist, a counseling therapist, or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so that you can start to tap into what your truth is and how you actually want to live your life when you start to separate from some of those messages that you got from other people, because it can really strongly influence the direction of our life. And depending on what's going on, what the trauma or the difficulty has been, then that might direct you towards different types of therapy. But a good starting point is connecting with another person, because part of it is repatterning. So if I learn that people are dangerous, or that people in positions of power are going to harm me, then I don't unlearn that in isolation. I have to actually be in another relationship with someone who's in a position of power, or who's in a position where I'm investing, where they don't harm me. And they not only don't harm me, they treat me like I do matter. And they focus on, oh, like your emotions matter, your experience of this matter, tell me about it, let's work through it together. And that is one of the ways that the healing starts to happen, because then that healthy part of us takes that and goes, oh, this is what a healthy relationship is supposed to feel like. And then we start to apply that to our lives outside of therapy.
Awesome, thank you. And so the chat box question is kind of similar, but more so to do, like, if you are aware of something that is happening, maybe like an unstable family environment, how would you contribute to mitigating that?
Yeah, that's really good too. I love your questions. Good group. So coaches are very much like teachers, and they are one of the most protective adults in the lives of youth. And so I can tell you as a psychiatrist that when I'm kind of interviewing people, then one of the most common themes in homes where there was either abuse or neglect or instability is that there was a protective teacher or coach who made a huge difference. And even having one stable adult who is sending you the message that that's not okay, or that you do matter and that it's not conditional, can make a huge difference in the life of a child. A cheesy example would be Harry Potter. Like, where would Harry Potter be without Hogwarts if he didn't have Dumbledore, for those of you who have followed Harry Potter, right? Like, he would be in this kind of crappy home with these abusive people who are telling him that he deserves to live under the stairs. And so it's also true in this context. So what you can do for them is be clear about what you're noticing that is or is not okay. Obviously, if there's any concern about child endangerment, then there's a legal duty to protect and to report if there's any imminent risk of harm to the child. And other than that, then I would encourage doing things like reflect and wonder. So that's a communication strategy where you reflect, you know, I'm noticing that, fill in the blank, be specific about the behavior. And I wonder, how can I support you? Or I wonder, you know, how are you dealing with that? So an example would be, I'm noticing that, you know, you seem really anxious when your dad comes to pick you up, or when your dad comes to tournaments. I wonder what that's about. Do you want to talk about it? Or I'm noticing that you're really worried about getting second instead of first. I wonder, where is that coming from for you? Is there a way that I can support you with that? So it's using that reflect and wonder to help them feel seen, heard, and like they matter. Because fundamentally, that's what we all want. Like, every disagreement basically is connected to someone not feeling seen, heard, or like they matter. And the more we can do that for one another, then the more we're showing each other compassion and teaching each other that that's what we deserve.
Awesome, I really like that. With CSEA, we've done some work on like communication and using the I notice statements, but I really like that I wonder, how that ties in. That's awesome. If anyone has follow-up questions on that, please write them in the chat box. But the next question, this is kind of a good flow. The next question has to do with if an athlete approaches a coach with a concern and indicates that they have not told their parents and ask you not to tell their parents, what is the best way to handle this situation? So maybe if the athlete approaches you with a concern around like depression or an eating disorder or anything like that.
Yeah, so the first thing is you would need to kind of do whatever risk assessment that you're able to do to figure out if there's an imminent risk, because, you know, eating disorders have a high death rate as well. as does suicide connected to depression. So you would want to get some sort of gauge of the severity of the situation, and then if there is an imminent risk, and if it's not, I like to use the approach of, if it's not a hell yes, then it's a hell no. And so if I don't walk away from that interaction going like, oh yeah, like that's a hell yes, I know that I did the right thing by saying, okay, well, we're going to monitor it together for now and then make a plan that way, versus if I have any doubt at all, you want to have a very low threshold for being clear that you have an obligation to connect with someone who can help them further. So in terms of what you can do with that, then it may be, let's say that you can agree not to tell their parents for whatever reason, because there isn't an imminent risk, but you make a plan with them to check in, and that maybe you can facilitate having a conversation with their parents, because sometimes they just need to feel like there's an ally who's there to start the conversation, or you can role play with them, or you can connect them to another adult who can help them. So you maybe will get some resources for mental health in youth, connect them to the youth crisis line, for instance. Or it might mean that you say, you know what, I really think you need to go see your family doctor. Who would your family doctor be? And then you can get agreement from them for you to call their family doctor to provide information and just say, hey, I'm a coach for whoever, and they've given me permission to just let you know that they're struggling with this and they probably need to see someone. And then you've kind of, it's like a relay race where you've like tagged in the other capable adult who has expertise in that area.
Great, thank you. Good follow-up. Does the age of the athlete matter? I keep the parents of my kids in the loop with almost all communication because most are still minors, or I encourage the swimmers to talk to their parents.
Yeah, generally speaking, the gray area starts to happen around 14. Under 14, then most people wouldn't feel comfortable keeping things from the parent, but the gray area starts around the age of kind of 14, and between 14 and 18, then it gets more and more gray as they get older. Good question.
Yeah, great question. And I will just add on too, from a coaching perspective, and I know safe sport is a huge topic right now. If an athlete is approaching you with a concern like that, it is always important to make sure there's another coach with you or an adult with you, just so to add that in. And then our last question, and feel free to write anything in the chat box, but our last question is, what are the best messages to relay to our anxious athletes during this uncertain time?
Awesome. So I would say that there are really seven really helpful cues to pass along, or behaviors, things to encourage to pass along to people who are struggling at this time. And so the first one would be to go on an attention diet. So we are being bombarded at the moment with threat messages. So, you know, between COVID, the shootings, the military deaths, job loss, what's going to happen to the economy, what's new normal going to look like. So we're being bombarded with all of these threat signals. And we're not actually meant to be in fight, flight, or freeze for prolonged periods of time. So when we're constantly exposing ourselves to these threat signals and we're not giving ourselves any time to downregulate in between, then we get caught in this state of fight or flight, or we tip into freeze. And that can look very different for different people, but it feels very unpleasant universally. So going on an attention diet where we encourage the athletes or the people to limit their exposure to social media and news to 2 or 3 reliable sources, and to only check those sources no more than 2 or 3 times a day. Because we naturally have this negativity bias where we want to, if there's a lion in the room with us, perceived threat. So if there's a lion in the room with us, we feel like the best thing to do is to constantly have our eye on the lion to know where it is. But in the context of social media and news and the internet, we could be glued to our phones and the computer 24/7, monitoring all of the different aspects of what's going on, and that's not good for us. So 2 to 3 reliable sources of information, only checking them 2 to 3 times a day. And ideally, I would recommend limiting the time that you spend checking it to no more than 20 minutes. More than that, we start to get more anxious and our mood drops. The next thing would be focusing on what we can control. So when our external environment is so chaotic and uncertain, then it becomes even more important that we are focused on being able to zoom out and not just remember that metaphor with the stage that I used at the beginning, where we zoom in on pain and suffering and distress. So instead of zooming in on all of the things that we can control, it's important to zoom out and intentionally focus on what are the things that I can control. So for instance, I start all of my days with a list of 10 things that I'm grateful for and 10 things that I can control. And there's no repeats ever. And it's a really helpful strategy, and I get my patients to do the same thing. So focusing on what you can control changes your experience of that moment, because you can imagine if I asked you all to make a list of 10 things you can't control, by number 10, all of us would be anxious. Because what we focus on changes our experience of that moment, and that changes our physiology. So focusing on what we can control, and then the next one is practicing gratitude. So you don't have to do the list of 10 like what I do. I do this for a living, so I'm a little hardcore about it. So most people can manage 3 things every day, no repeats. And for bonus marks, share it with someone. Share it as a text, call your mom, and share it with her. It doesn't matter who you share it with, but because we're social, it increases our investment in the truth of it when we do that. So going on an attention diet, focusing on what we can control, focusing on gratitude, which the other reason to do that is we can't be in threat and in gratitude at the same time. So it helps pull us out of that fight-flight response and helps us down-regulate. The next thing is to make a schedule. So tying into what we talked about in STAMP with having a purpose and mastery, then having a schedule offers us that sense of purpose and predictability. And predictability, when there's so much uncertainty, becomes very important, because predictability is a form of safety when we know what we can expect. So having a schedule, and then in that schedule, making sure that there is scheduled time to socialize, because we're a social species. Then we need to make sure that we're connecting with other people, whether it's via text or video chat or email. And then also making sure that there's room for exercise in there as well, because when we're in fight or flight, and we're all in various states of fight or flight and freeze at the moment because of all of the things that are going on in our circumstance, then we're all tipping into those areas. So it's especially important that we have some sort of healthy discharge for that to come out in order to be well. Otherwise, it's going to start to manifest as being irritable, starting to bicker, getting stomach aches, getting tense, not being able to sleep or settle at the end of the night, those sorts of things. So if we don't want that to happen, we have to give it that alternative healthy discharge. And remembering that one of the ways we can do that is by focusing on name it, soothe it, move it, that we talked about earlier. And then lastly, using music. So I don't know if any of you have ever watched a thriller movie on mute, but it ends up being pretty uneventful, and it's a lot of like dark hallways and rooms, empty rooms. So music is actually one of the direct pathways that regulates our autonomic nervous system, because sound, facial expression, and tone or sound are 2 of the things that are very directly related and provide us with safety cues. So using music that is soothing for us, so even having a playlist that is like soothing, nostalgic music can help us down-regulate when we're especially activated. And alternatively, if you find that you're in a freeze response where you're really lethargic, detached, numb, apathetic, you don't care about anything, you can't think straight, then having an activating playlist of music that makes you want to like dance or hop around. And that would be also a time that using the Swiss ball would be really helpful, because even just sitting on the Swiss ball requires us to stabilize, and we naturally do that bouncing that I talked about before. And so it's really hard to be in an immobilization response when we are moving. So it's going to help us pull out of that. So those would be the top 7 things that I would recommend talking to your anxious athletes about.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There are a couple more questions in the chat box. So I'll start off with the first one. With young athletics usually comparing success with athletic ability, how would you motivate kids who may be developing slower than most of the team?
Have you, I would ask I don't know who asked that, but I would speak to that through the work of Carol Dweck, who has done a lot of research on the growth mindset and the power of yet, where it's people thrive and continue to do well when we make the comparators their past behavior or their past performance instead of comparison across other people. And the power of yet ties into, you know, if I say I can't do this, then that actually switches off and sends less blood flow and activation to the parts of the brain that are responsible for perseverance and problem solving. But if I just add the word yet, then I'm not there yet, then that actually keeps those parts of the brain active for longer. So, and it's just a word. It sounds very inconsequential, but it actually makes a difference on fMRI studies. So using the power of yet and focusing on a growth mindset instead of outcomes-based, making it process-based is really what that whole approach is about. I'm mindful of our time, so I'm trying not to elaborate too much.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think there's just one left. So you talk about others harming the athlete, but what about when an athlete hurts themselves? I have had 3 athletes that were cutters and the parents were aware. How can the coach help support the athlete?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So think of it as so it's great that the parents are aware. That would be one of the things that I think you would have to disclose if you found out that one of your younger athletes was cutting, that because you don't know, how that's going to go. I would use the reflect and wonder to find out with your athletes, I'm noticing that you cut again. Have you noticed any patterns to when that happens and when you don't do that? Are there particular kinds of stressors that make you go in that way? Is that kind of part of who you want to be? Like, does that line up with the version of you that you want to bring forward in the world? And if it doesn't, then I wonder if there might be some other forms of coping that you could learn to do instead of that. Because it's a coping mechanism for a lot of people. It's a way of using physical pain as a way to distract from or pull away from emotional pain, or it can also be a form of physically manifesting how people are feeling about themselves. Like, I can't tell you that I feel terrible, but I can show you that I feel terrible. So there are different motivations that go into that. And so using that reflect and wonder, but always in that very open, compassionate, curious stance with a willingness to facilitate them connecting to other people to learn healthier coping. And then if you can also connect it to, who they want to be moving forward. So it can even start with a conversation about, so when you think about yourself in like 5 years, what does that look like? And part of the question as you're meandering through that dream with them can be, so in 5 years from now, do you see yourself cutting? And if you don't, then what do you think you might be doing instead when you're feeling stressed? Or if you do, like, is that a part of now that you want to bring forward with you? Or would you be interested in having a conversation about maybe how you can leave that part behind? Oh, awesome. I see somebody already adds the words yet a lot. Good job.
Okay, great. I think that's all the questions that were in the chat box. If anyone has anything else, just speak up. I know we are at like an hour and this is such great stuff. So thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. This is amazing. I know a lot of coaches have been asking for this topic, so we really appreciate you coming on and providing us with all of this information. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for coming on this morning, especially those out west. I see we have some BC people, so it's really early out there. So thank you so much for attending, and hope to see you at some future sessions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. Great questions, really.
Thanks, everyone.